Guys, hello. Welcome back to the Omnia Performance Podcast. I'm JB and I'm rocking it solo today. Today, we're going to talk about something that underpins literally everything you will ever do as a hybrid athlete. We're going to be talking about base building, why it matters, how it works, what most people get wrong, and how to set yourself up for a genuinely productive winter of training. So, as always, I want this to be as helpful for you guys as possible. I want to give you some ideas for how to structure your own training. Whether you're brand new to the hybrid space or endurance space or strength space or whatever, I'm going to try and make it applicable to a lot of you in these different scenarios. Or you could have already had like a good few seasons under your belt. Towards the end, I'll talk a little bit about our wintering program that we've got coming up at the start of 2026. And it's pretty much designed specifically to put all of this kind of stuff into practice. And the link is in the show notes if you would like to check it out afterwards, or you can hit pause, you can go check it out straight away, but come back, please. So let's dive right into it. So first of all, what the hell is base building? We need to know what it actually is. We need to lay down some definitions. It's like the word base is honestly something which is quite often misunderstood. It's not like a lot of people kind of think of base building and off seasons as being synonymous, and they're kind of like just easy weeks until things get like exciting again, or a bit of a pause in the calendar before the real training starts again. But to be honest with you, like base building is the real training, and if you're not treating it as such, you're really missing out. You're leaving a lot of potential gains on the table. And it's the phase where you develop your aerobic engine. You build your resilience. I know that's a word that gets thrown about a lot, but it's true for the purposes of base building. And it gives you some technical competence that comes with doing lots and lots of repetition, a bit like kind of practice and acquiring skills. And that allows you to handle more tough work later. And with like, this might be quite a helpful way of thinking about it. If you don't have this phase in place, your intensity that you stack onto your training won't stick, okay? Your progress will become inconsistent, your recovery will tank, little niggles will crop up because you're not well accustomed to doing the higher intensity work in a plentiful, meaningful amount, and your motivation spirals. If you feel crap, you're going to perform like crap, and you know your motivation to do more is going to be in the gutter. And a few things we've got to remember. So if we do a proper base building phase, it will allow us to do these things really well. So it'll increase our aerobic capacity, and the vast majority of, irrespective of whether you do a marathon, a half marathon, a 5K, a mile, they're all incredibly aerobic dominant events. So increasing your aerobic capacity is key. It'll strengthen your heart and lungs, somewhat tied to building your aerobic capacity. It's one piece of the puzzle. It'll increase your mitochondrial density. So think of these as like, you probably remember this classic phrase from GCSE biology, the powerhouse of the cell. Think of it as like your body's energy factories. It'll increase the structural durability of your muscles, your tendons, your ligaments. So if you can build up to doing a significant amount of volume of running per week, or cycling or swimming or whatever it is, you'll build specific durability and toughness of the tissues that get taxed and stressed when you do those tasks and sports. It'll increase your movement economy, so you can perform the same level of intensity with less oxygen cost. It will boost your mental resilience. So this is huge. If you're training for a long event, really putting in those miles or hours on the bike or whatever it is will really, really help coming for later. It gets you callous to spending a lot of time in the saddle or on your feet. And perhaps the most underrated thing is that it prepares you for doing the higher intensity work later, okay? Now, in short, too long, didn't listen version, it just basically gets your body to become more capable of doing more, okay? Or doing more often, or with less stress. Now, hybrid athletes particularly need this, right? So you're not just building fitness in one single discipline. You're often laying down the groundwork in multiple different qualities and activities. So things surrounding strength, building muscle mass, endurance, speed, power, muscular endurance. A big part of the time, if it's not the actual performing of the task, it could be the recovery of it, but your aerobic system underpins a lot of it. And this base building phase is key in getting that aerobic system up to scratch, Okay, so we spoke about the basics of base building and what it is, who it's for, why it's important. We've now got to talk about periodization. We can't really talk about one without talking about the other. Now, let's keep it pretty simple. Usually, traditionally, we think of periodization as being the structure behind your training. It's how we organize our training in the calendar. We can look at it as like four separate sort of components, if you like, okay, that are somewhat related. So when we look at a macro cycle, that's like the big picture. So if you're an Olympic athlete, you could have like a 4-year macro cycle, that time in between Olympics. You recover from one and then you'd start to build towards the next. Or for us normies who aren't good enough to go to the Olympics, but our training is still just as worthy of big attention and focus, we can look at it as like 6 months between races or 12 months between races, shorter period of time, but still for significant big picture. We've then got mesocycles. So these are usually smaller blocks of 4 to 12 weeks with a particular focus. So it could be like an aerobic building mesocycle or a hypertrophy mesocycle. Then microcycles. So this is usually in reference to like a week, okay, where across that week we'll manage your intensity, your volume, and subsequent recovery. And then we could also argue there was a fourth component of like a deload or a reload week or 2 weeks or whatever. And this is where you just intentionally place low training stress to make sure that the adaptations settle and stick. So it brings your fatigue down and it just allows you the space to recover and to adapt to the training stress that you've placed upon yourself in the previous micro or mesocycle. Now, really important for us guys as hybrid athletes, we've got to rely on very, very good planning because we're often trying to balance out two competing demands. You don't want to stack all of your intensity on at once. It just doesn't make sense. This periodization just lets you move through different phases where you build up, you consolidate things, you sharpen without burning out. It actually adds some structure to that key process, which is needed to indeed get better. So let's now talk about base building for endurance. We've got a few different kind of reasons why we might want to build a base. Endurance is probably the biggest one. So when we talk about like an aerobic base, what we usually mean is this. It's like increasing your capacity to work for longer, harder, recover faster, so you can tolerate a little bit more intensity later. And this reason is why elite endurance athletes usually spend a lot of their year in these base phases. And it's also why when you take a recreational athlete like or a normie like perhaps you or I, and when we skip these base building phases, we tend to plateau quite quickly because we're trying to build upon quite shaky foundations, as it were, and we just can't adapt because we don't have the necessary base behind us, basically. So if we've got a good aerobic base and we take our time and we really put the effort into building it up, we can expect to get better endurance. We can expect to recover better in between intervals. We're less likely to get injured because we're going to be well accustomed to all of that volume, all of that pounding of the pavement, of the trails if we're runners. It makes us more efficient at using fuel. So we may get a similar work rate and intensity out at a lower fuel utilization, which is good for our economy. And it also helps us build up a higher ceiling to add future intensity on. So we may handle faster intervals without burning out. We may handle more intervals, so like a greater volume. So that, of course, you can see how that would be really helpful. Remember that the more harder training you can recover from, the better your results are going to be. So having this base building in beforehand is going to make a massive difference. So this is where the block periodization comes in. It can be really useful. So as an example, you could have like an endurance block, like where you do lots of longer, easy runs. You really build up the volume and you push on building that aerobic economy up. Then we could have a VO2 block where you focus on doing some shorter and harder intervals. And then you could have a block where you focus more on threshold, where you build that sustainable speed. But all of these blocks work better when you've got a strong aerobic base. So even that endurance block, you can't really go into that and expect to do these long, easy runs without the aerobic base behind you, because you're going to struggle. You're not going to have that necessary aerobic base to be able to handle being on your feet or on the saddle for that long. So it's why we need that underpinning base. Now, the example that always comes to mind whenever we talk about base building, it's quite helpful sometimes when we think of things in extremes. There was a speed skater who is called Niels van der Poel, and he won an Olympic gold medal broke world records, but he spent basically months just doing nothing except for building his aerobic base. So despite being a speed skater, he spent about 30 hours a week on the bike. Now, of course, we don't really know like the specifics of how long he did this for or anything like that. This is like although actually I believe there is a research paper out there. If I find it, I'll pop it in the show notes if you're interested in reading more. But being on the bike for 30 hours a week and you're not even a cyclist is insane. But it's because he understood that importance of aerobic base building. Now, it's not applicable or necessary for people like you or I to do that amount of volume in 1 week, but it just illustrates the point that he knew that value of building up his aerobic base. That long, steady, low intensity work that allows you to do a lot of it was incredibly useful for him. Now, that may not be the case for us where we are, we've got less time available than that to get better, most likely. I know I certainly do. So it may be wiser for us to spend a little less time doing that, but slightly higher intensity. But the point is still that we need to build up that aerobic base. Now, he wasn't like speed skating during this time or doing high intensity work. He didn't even compete or race or anything like that for over a year because he just understood that very important, simple truth that if your aerobic capacity is large, you can tolerate and absorb more intensity than before. So there's a lot to be taken away from that for your own training. Now, when he did a threshold block later on, it only worked because he had this huge foundation. He was able to handle way more volume doing that than if he didn't have that base. So remember, we don't need that 30 hours a week like our man Nils. That's not the lesson here. The lesson is the principle, and you've got to build your engine first and then sharpen it rather than trying it the other way around, or else you are going to plateau. So we've spoken a lot there about your fitness and endurance training side of building a base. We have to also think about building a base in terms of our strength as well. So if you think a lot of endurance first focused athletes miss out on this. So if you have a base as a strength athlete, you're going to learn and refine your different movement patterns. You can become better coordinated. If you can do that and be more efficient in the lifts, you'll be able to lift more load, produce more force, which will increase your muscle mass, your hypertrophy, and also building strength as well. You'll improve your general strength across your big compound lifts. So you might have these kind of almost like benchmarks, like bench press, overhead press, deadlift, squat, etc., etc. And it might also improve your tissue durability as well. So certainly doing stuff like plyometrics, teaching your tendons to be nice and springy and elastic, which coincidentally also improves your movement economy. Yeah, they're all kind of very big reasons to include strength training in an appropriate dose in your base building program, Now, unless we do this in later strength phases, your maximal strength, power, sport specific work, we put all of those in a particular order when we periodize properly, it won't be very effective unless we've already done that base building. So we could sequence it like this. So you could have a foundational phase where you're getting used to lots of different movements. You're focusing on like your full body strength, a fair bit of variety in there, which would be fun. And it like keeps your motivation high when you're just starting out, gets you over that potential inertia. And then you may look to focus on hypertrophy. So building muscle to support your future strength. A strength phase might come next where you're loading up a little bit heavier. You're perhaps reducing the reps because you're getting that bit closer to your 1 rep max. And then you might have a phase where you're building power, where you're focusing on speed of your force development. And you can only really handle this harder work and more specific work if you've laid down the groundwork. Now, I should also mention here and go back to talking about periodizing the endurance stuff as well. Let's say you're in a hypertrophy phase. That does not mean that you just train hypertrophy. You don't need to think about it as like a binary choice between like, oh, do I focus on hypertrophy? Do I focus on strength? You can have things as a bit of a sliding scale. So if you visualize it as like percentage of time spent in the gym, in a hypertrophy phase, you might only spend 10% of your time focusing on those heavier loads. So as an example, you could go in, you could warm up for squats, you could hit a top single or a top double or triple at like 8 RPE. Then you can move on to your hypertrophy. So what you're essentially doing there is at the very least, you're maintaining the strength that you've gained, but you're just moving on after that to a little bit more of something which is focused on the goal of that block. So you may do your heavy singles, doubles or triples or whatever, then move on to your sets of 5 to 10 on squats, which might be a little bit more appropriate to building up enough volume to indeed enable you to get bigger quads, glutes, etc. So hopefully that makes sense. And with regards to the endurance work, just because you're in an aerobic base building phase doesn't mean you never, ever, ever do any higher intensity running. It could just mean that you incorporate some strides into your easier runs, or you have a dedicated week where you have your interval day, and across the weeks you rotate between week 1 is doing some at threshold pace, week 2 is doing some bits at 5k pace, just to make sure that you keep that skill of running fast despite doing tons and tons of slow aerobic work. Now, we spoke about the strength, we've spoken about the endurance, but we're not into just one or another, right? We are wanting to combine both. And of course, we want to combine both without burning out. You've probably heard us guys and Fergus talk before about the 200% example, where you can't expect yourself to perform well if you're performing 100% of a strength training program and 100% of an endurance program. Stack the two together, it makes 200%. You're really testing your body's ability to recover and handle that volume. Chances are you're not going to come out the other side, and it's certainly not going to look very pretty. So if you want both qualities, like having a big engine and a big, strong, durable body, we can't do everything all the time at full tilt. We've got to balance things out somehow. So first of all, we got to remember, number one is to prioritize your goals. So if you're pushing your running progression, your strength might sit a little bit closer to maintenance, or you may already be fortunate enough to know what your minimum effective dose is, and then you can use that as your starter, and you can build up your volume and or intensity from there. However, if you're building up strength, your running stays aerobic and controlled, or you can look to top up your training volume with the bike. So as an example for myself at the moment, I am doing quite a lot of track work and also quite a lot of top end strength work. And I want to make sure that I'm training for a 500-pound squat. So I want to make sure that my recoverability is up there for my strength session. So leaning into a bit more minimum effective volume for running and using the bike as a tool to get my aerobic base up without smashing the hell out of my joints, muscles, etc., is a really smart thing to do, because I'm prioritizing that goal of getting my squat up. We also want to try and align some phases. So certain phases are going to work better than others as combinations. So for example, doing your higher volume running actually pairs really nicely with like a foundational lifting program or a hypertrophy strength training program. But it may not pair quite so well with stuff that requires very high force outputs. So if you're working on, I don't know, for example, a plyometric phase or a power phase, doing tons and tons of long, slow aerobic work might not be, certainly for running, might not be quite such a great combination. However, again, we don't want to think of these things as binary. Just because you do aerobic work alongside your jump training or your plyometric training doesn't render it completely useless. It might just dampen some of the potential adaptations. That's all. We want to make sure intensity's managed. So if you start out the week with your hardest run, and then the next day you do a lower body lifting session, then the next day you do a threshold run, then you might do a hard session on the bike on a Thursday, and then on the Friday you might end up with some more lower body lifting, and then Saturday you do a long run. Your legs are getting absolutely battered, and we're putting lots of high intensity days in a row, which can be quite difficult to recover from. So quite paradoxically, we can think about consolidating our stress into one part of the week. So you may choose, if you have the luxury of doing a double day and you have the time, you could combine your lower body strength training session with your hardest bike or running session, doing it on the same day, AM and PM, or indeed one after the other, if that's all you have time for, and you make sure it's well fueled in between, etc. But that can actually work really well, because what that means is you have got the rest of the week to recover before you do that again. And on all of the other days, you are training qualities which aren't related to what you've just trained. So as an example, you could say, right, Monday is for lower body strength work and sprints. Tuesday is for upper body strength. So then that's got nothing to do with what you've just trained on that previous day. Then you may go into a threshold run on the Wednesday. Then on Thursday, you may go into like an aerobic run with some lower body hypertrophy work. So you can see how we are separating the week and blocking it off into chunks to tax certain qualities at one end of the week, rest them during the other part of the week. So by the time that week rolls around again, you're all recovered, you're ready to go. Now, another thing and a variation on that is to keep that kind of almost like polarization, whatever the right word would be. Make sure that your hard days are indeed performed hard and your easy days are easy. And if you're going to have recovery time, make sure it's genuinely off. I think a lot of people are like, oh yeah, I'll go do a high rocks class or a CrossFit class or a recovery run. Try and actually just make sure that unless you really need to top your volume up with all these little extra eaty bits of training, try and make sure you do actually just have some genuine recovery time. Like go to the cinema, go for a walk, do something which isn't related to training or something which you're trying to disguise as active recovery, but is actually really a proper workout. So if we have dedicated, easier running days, make sure that those days are indeed easy. So we're not getting a hangover and residual fatigue going into the harder days. Because if that's the case, guess what? You're not going to be able to perform your hard days actually that hard. Now, the next thing is to make sure that you're flexible and you adjust your training as you go. So we've got to remember that periodization and how we block out your training is merely a framework. It's not like it's not prison. You're adapting things as you go based on like fatigue, recovery, life. Like it happens. It's stressful. Your motivation's going to come and go. You may get injured. Sadly, that's a fact of doing these things. Injury is sadly an inevitability to a point, and how your blood performance markers undulate as well. You're going to need to kind of think on your feet somewhat, and you're going to need to be adaptable and flexible. And when you get this principle right and you don't hold yourself to very unrealistic standards, this interference effect that we often get told about, we often read about, it becomes a lot smaller than most people think. And you eventually find that your training in seemingly unrelated areas actually supports your endurance training and your endurance training supporting your strength training by, for example, increasing your ability to recover between sets or whatever. Everything kind of compounds and comes together. Sometimes it's just a bit of a difficult thing at first when you're learning your body, what you can recover from, and how that's then going to obviously impact your performance. So next, we're also going to talk about how base building is like your winter superpower. So winter is probably like the most productive time of year to build a base. And apart from Christmas, this is probably because we have like fewer social events. So certainly as we go into like January and February, things tend to chill out a little bit on the social side of things. It's cold. We want to do less stuff going out. It's not like the summer vibes. There's less social pressure to peak as well, because you're probably not going to be doing your best racing in freezing cold weather, pissing wet rain, snow, depending on where you live. It gives us therefore a little bit more space to be consistent, so we don't have all of these kind of interruptions. Despite what I said about the weather, sometimes having a bit of a cooler temperature, like we had a pretty gnarly summer here in the UK, and I know some of the guys who listen to the podcast and consume our content also live in some very, very warm climates. So when we have a nice cool winter, sometimes it's easier to get out and to perform without sweating buckets, feeling crap in the in that kind of summer sun and humidity. So that can be quite helpful as well. It can also allow us a bit more time to focus on building routines. So getting all of this kind of training habitual in the winter is a great idea, because by the time those tougher summer months, tougher in terms of like finding it harder to stick to your training, as soon as those months roll around, you're going to lean into the habits and routines that you've built throughout the winter and carry that on going into your warmer months. And then we also have less competition from those higher intensity training blocks coming in as well. So you can just really kind of knuckle down and focus on building your base. If you can build up like circa 3 to 4 months of real solid base building work through the winter, spring and summer become tons easier. Everything will feel a lot smoother, a lot easier, more powerful. Now, I do see it every single year. If I have athletes who commit to a proper base building phase and don't obsess over trying to peak for races during the winter or away from their competitive period, they go into that next season of marathons, half Ironmans, sprint triathlons, whatever their jam is. They come into that next season feeling calmer, fitter, more confident, and usually have a lot less injuries as well, because they're not just constantly digging themselves into a hole with all that high intensity training, racing, peaking, you name it. So with all of this being said, this is exactly why we built the wintering. So the wintering is a structured, supported by us 12-week hybrid GPP, General Physical Preparedness Program, designed to help you build a stronger aerobic base, a stronger, more resilient body, give you better movement quality, give you better lifting mechanics, better conditioning, more muscle mass, more strength, and it's going to give you a much higher training ceiling for the rest of the year. So as you go into spring, in towards race season, you're going to feel awesome. You're going to be really ready to sharpen things up, get yourself race ready. Certainly much more so had you not have done the base building prior. And we deliver all this good stuff with great community support. We're going to give you some weekly challenges. We've got some spicy little sessions to be doing midweek, our Wednesday wintering. We've got accountability coming in the form of communication with us, as well as your fellow athletes on our circle group. You're going to get guidance with the coaching, and we've got some really, really cool ways of keeping the program accessible for beginners and more experienced athletes alike. So it's awesome. I'm really proud of myself and the team for putting all of this together. It's going to be awesome fun. Now, it's everything that we've talked about today, and it's all put into a framework that you can actually follow without overthinking it. I'm aware that what I've spoken about today is quite a lot to take in. It's a very whistle-stop tour of everything that could be put into place with base building, but the wintering just puts it all into one place, so you can literally plug yourself in and crack on. So if you want to take winter seriously and to go into next year, 2026, with some real momentum, wintering is going to give you that foundation. And you can find the link to join or find out more in the show notes below. So guys, listen, thanks for listening. Hopefully this gives you a bit of a fresh perspective on why base building matters so much. Remember that engine's always got to come first. Then you can sharpen things up later. And if you get that order right, everything you do in your hybrid training will get easier. So guys, listen, if you've enjoyed the episode, share it with someone you know who's about to start their off season or you think could benefit with a bit of base building. And if you want to join us in for the wintering, all the details are waiting for you below. So thanks for listening. See you in the next one.